and people were calling me names was because I was scoring goals. She told me the best way to get back at them was to work harder, score more goals, and be successful. I know my grandparents experienced racism when they moved from Japan to Canada. My dad spent time in the internment camps in BC. I think we've come a long way since then, but we have a long way to go. I think it's crazy that hard work and success sometimes isn't enough. And it would be my hope and my dream that my kids or their kids would not have to experience anything that my family's gone through in the past. Join the conversation on anti-Asian racism June 10th to 11th.
I'm an immigrant kid. We arrived many years ago, and at that time, my brother and I, we were the only two Asian kids in the entire school. We were teased a lot in the playground, particularly, and we learned that there were a lot of kids that stood up for us and made us feel really welcome. We learned if we want to play in the same sandbox, we need to not tolerate it. We need to speak up and say, this is not right, and this is not who we are. This is not part of our value system. Act now to stop anti-Asian racism.
Hello, bonjour, and good morning. My name is Solomon. It's a pleasure to be here today to moderate the second panel today, Common Cause, Coalition Building Across Asian Canadian Communities. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the city of Vancouver, and we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. As I said earlier, my name is Zul Suleiman, and I'm very thankful to be invited to host this plenary. For me, issues of racism and anti-racism work are lived realities. As a refugee to Canada from Uganda in East Africa, a Muslim, and someone with ancestral roots in Gujarat in India, I have experienced firsthand the brunt of racism. My response has been to engage in anti-racism work vigorously and publicly. This panel is a part of the work I do. Today, similar to the first panel for the Q&A portion, we will be using the online audience engagement tool, Slido. You can begin to submit questions now and throughout the event. You will also be able to begin voting on all submitted questions shortly. Please go to Slido, slido.com, and insert the code panel2AAR, which is all one word, to begin. Please join me in welcoming each of the panelists who are part of our discussion today. My colleague, Patrick Leong, will be assisting me with the introductions this morning after I've introduced Satwinder, Lara, and Elene. Dr. Satwinder Bains is Associate Professor in Social Cultural Media Studies in the College of Arts of the University of the Fraser Valley. Lara Honrado currently leads a pre-seed funded startup developing tools to mitigate bias and discrimination in hiring and employee retention. Elene Lam is an activist, community organizer, educator, and human rights defender and PhD candidate at McMaster University in the School of Social Work. Patrick Leong is a graduating history honors with international relations student at the University of British Columbia. He recently completed his honors thesis about the anti-W5 movement, which was a significant anti-racist movement led by Chinese Canadians. Patrick will now introduce the other esteemed members of our panel.
Thank you, Zul. Je serai aussi modérateur francophone pendant ce panel. I'll introduce Sophie and Julie in French now. Je vais présenter Sophie et Julie en français. Donc, prochainement, j'aimerais introduire Dr. Sophie Hamisultane. Elle est sociologue clinicienne et professeure à l'École de travail social de l'Université de Montréal, et elle s'intéresse à la complexité psychosociale des rapports d'interculturalité. Elle a spécifiquement travaillé avec des personnes descendantes de migrants sur les questions de reconnaissance et d'imaginaire dans le processus.
So, and she's worked on the process of developing of healthcare, taking into account the social phenomenon, the discrimination, the historical context, and social the forms of oppression, and post-colonial aspects. And finally, Julie Tran, who is a candidate to a mastership in social services at the University of Ottawa. Her thesis has to do with mental charge on people in Quebec who are victims of racial discrimination. She's working with children and wife who suffer from family violence and their anti-racism aspect. She's also an administrator of a help group that looks after racism in Quebec. And she's militates against anti-Asian racism. So you may also ask your questions in French as well, and they will be translated. So don't hesitate either to use the interpretation function in order to listen to all the dialogues in French.
Great, thank you, Patrick. I have kept the introductions short. Each of the esteemed speakers has provided their own biographies, which are available online. I urge you to go read them to get a better context for who each one of them is and how they contribute to this work daily. Now I would like to invite one of our panelists to open the discussion, and perhaps Satwinder, you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Zul. Can you hear me okay? Thank you to the organizers for creating this inclusive national conversation on anti-Asian racism, much needed at this time and at any time. Today, I'm coming from the unceded and ancestral lands of the Stolo peoples, the people of the river in the Central Fraser Valley, and give thanks to them for sharing the bounties of this beautiful and productive land. I acknowledge, first of all, my own personal power and privilege and work every day to dismantle class and caste systems of power that are inherent in my Asian Canadian cultural identity. I too want to pay respect, my respect and empathy and to the families impacted by the Kamloops tragedy and grieve with all Canadians on the recent hate crime against one of our own in London, Ontario. Our work on anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous racism and hate, anti-caste matters, anti-Black and anti-Asian racism, discrimination, violence, and daily aggressions, I believe must be foregrounded by a response to the ongoing rights-based struggles of First Nations, Inuit, and Indigenous peoples of Canada. I want to recognize the emotional labor that is needed to do this work. Everyone here and those informing us must be recognized for their willingness to share their trauma, their pain, their anguish, stress, and experiences. This must be uppermost in our minds as we work to recollect, to remine, and reimagine the history of Canada. I'd like to draw our attention to the fact that racialized people and immigrants like myself are also complicit in displacing Indigenous, Inuit, and First Nations peoples. The true and inclusive history that includes the harm of our actions has not been taught in our educational system. And active erasure, omission, and neglect is part of the Canadian historical record. And we all have committed to the work to correct this record that includes our histories and our experiences written by us, told by us, for us, and with us. A national strategy on public education on Indigenous rights-based history for all Canadians is a moral imperative for our country. What the Kamloops tragedy profoundly affected us and affected me was the First Nations community members' call for hope, for peace, for forgiveness. But I believe learning how to forgive, and I'm on that journey, does not preclude us from forgetting. We must continue to challenge the racism of the past and the present. We must challenge the status quo, the inequities, disparities present in our daily lives. The example of Islamophobia, the constant us and them, the narratives, the divides. It should not take fatal and brutal evidence to legitimize their and our experiences. It's as if being human is not enough. We hear these days the words of solidarity from many facets of our society, and we're emboldened by that and empowered by that. In this session, we want actively to work to find and build real and intentional solidarity by breaking down social, racial, cultural, political, economic, sexual orientation divides, those barriers and obstructions, and help us create a roadmap for this work. We know from recent reports that there has been a higher per capita average of anti-Asian attacks since the pandemic began, 700% more in BC alone, and something like 1,000% more across the country. And we have seen some damning numbers, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. I'm going to suggest that we need to do two things. We need to work within our community and build capacity by doing the following. And by not doing the following 6 things, perhaps our work would be incomplete. So internal community solidarity work in Asian Canadian communities is required. We need to step up and build up that solidarity across our own kind of silos that we've created within our communities. So I think number one, we really need to work to combat the fear, that real fear, that fear of going out, of being a person of color, of wearing a turban, wearing a hijab, of wearing whatever we wish based on our culture and our faith, of being attacked, of being vulnerable, of verbal abuse, as has been told in the last session, and much worse, as we have seen. Number two is isolation. The mental health conversation in the first session and other conversations that will continue around real isolation, never leaving home, staying in your family mix, not making new friends, afraid of what strangers might say and do, and no provocation on our part, on your part, for that to happen. Number three is silence. I know there's a lot of conversation going on about the silence around racism. There is an inward silence as well. There is no proper frequency to our messages, our stories, our challenges, our triumphs, and the long enduring silent scream of our ancestors. We need to find that frequency and find solidarity with the groups that will allow us to do that. Ensuring that we are not being co-opted out of our stories is number four. Our narratives, our histories need to be written by us, for us, and with us. Number five, challenging the marginalization and minimalization of our human experiences. Racism denies our rightful access, and not having to justify our existence is important. We need to be who we are as full, authentic human beings. Number six, exclusion among our communities. At play for children, at school for young adults, at work for working adults, in neighborhoods for families, in care facilities, in the justice system, in the media. We need to ensure that exclusion does not happen. On the other side, I believe that working to build capacity within our communities requires us to engage and involve the external communities and work with them based on not on their demands, but on us, asking them to share the burden of this and to carry the burden themselves. So we've moved away from educating people and saying, do the work and then come speak to us. So I would suggest we need to ask dominant communities to dismantle hatred, and we need to call out white supremacy, its inherent, implicit, and explicit racism, and its denial of racism, the implicit and explicit violence, the embedded and condoned systemic discrimination, the coded standards of exclusion, privilege, and power wherever it exists. Number two, we need to question the continuous thread of intentional racialization, which has the effect of imposing burdens on an individual or a group not imposed upon others. And this is very, very limiting. Challenging the minimization of whiteness in acts of hate and terror, especially in the media and the justice system. Those two need to be addressed. We need to advocate for full resources to combat the deep and abiding damage that has been done and the after effects that is occurring through intergenerational trauma. Number four, we need to deeply understand and work to build to account hold to account individuals and institutions that perpetuate the violence of the past and continue to do that in the present. Holding individuals and institutions is difficult to hold them to account for change. And in the previous session, it almost seems like it is impossible. But we must ask for that, and not just platitudes, but real change that gets embedded in institutional structures and the hierarchy of power, which needs to be questioned about transparency and openness and inclusion. Number 6 is calling for dismantling of patriarchy, of hierarchy, of oligarchy in our public institutions, in our communities, and in our structures of influence, especially, like I said, with the media. Of course, there is no rest for all of us. All the sectors that are going to be discussed in the afternoon are sectors that are important, that need to be engaged. We need to understand radicalization. We need to understand intergenerational trauma, systemic violence, institutional complicity. We need to demand accountability, but how do we do that? Divided, we can't do that. United, we can do more. We need to debunk the theory of us and them and the model minority. We need to fight the divisions imposed upon us by colonial systems. In conclusion, I want to say that the work of building coalitions across Asian Canadian communities has started already. This is one example. But we need to mature these ideas and commitments. And I'm looking forward to the closing comments where we hear about where we go from here. A call for us to come together to develop a national action plan with Asian Canadian communities across the country through our collective desire to effect change that is empowered by us, for us, and with us. The time is now. And I think this conference is gathering, this conversation, national conversation, provides the impetus for us to break down those geographical barriers that prevent us from meeting across this vast nation. And perhaps the pandemic has given us a silver cloud that we can actually meet across platforms of exchange like this one, where we can do the work. Thank you, Zul.
Thank you, Satwinder, for those powerful enumerated comments of the challenges of solidarity building and the work that's ahead of us. Next, we're going to have presentations by Sophie and Julie, who will also have a PowerPoint presentation for us.
Bonjour, merci.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So very briefly, I will introduce the PowerPoint presentation. As I mentioned before, as Patrick mentioned, I'm working on people coming from my first research had to do with migrant descendants born in France and in Quebec. So my origin is Asian. My parents come from Vietnam, but I wanted to understand with this clinical social approach, I wanted to understand the suffering result from exclusion for things that were never said. So I noticed a lot of absence of meaning among migrant descendants and the lack of meaning, which of course generates suffering. So it's from there that I started doing my research.
Okay. Donc voilà, c'est... Voilà.
So people descendant from migrants, Asian migrants. So Julie and I will speak first, and then Julie will take over. We'll try to stay within the 5 minutes allocated to us. So racism and what is at stake among descendants of migrants, and the importance, of course, of sort of replace all this stakes for future generation. A few theoretical elements to show the different aspects of what is at stake, which are considerable. For instance, the fact that descendants from migrants So the statistics indicate that people of second and third generation have salaries lower than not racialized people, which is important for their well-being in society. We also know that 49% of the Canadian population by 2036 will be represented by people coming from migrants, and half of these people come from Asia, and which represent a big chunk of humanity, 3/5 of humanity. I think that what is important to understand as well, to come through the suffering, is a social and historical context in order to react on the former exclusion lived by these migrants. In Quebec, we have to understand that it's not all the same socializing context. I will not get into details because we don't have the time here.
Les souffrances.
But the pain and the identity conflicts can also be related to the history itself
Du Québec.
of Quebec, its positioning as a francophone society, confronted the anglophone society, but also by the fact that the Quebec society is very influenced in its decisions by the French Republican context, which is very different from the North American context. So it can also create problems at the level of socializing. For instance, when we talk about values, the Quebec values, or for instance, the laicity imported in Quebec, which looks very much like the French context from France, but has a lot less meaning in Quebec. So there's all these conflictual aspects that resonate as well in the development of identities. Of course, I won't talk about all the context of the beginning of the 20th century with the oppression of the Japanese and Chinese communities. So we have antecedents in Quebec. So each time there are big events, there is, let's say, some victim, in particular during the Second World War. All these feelings were against the Asian communities. It's important to understand also to deconstruct where things come from and to give some meaning is a relationship to foreign countries of where those people are born. So there's Canada versus Quebec. So the socialization base is different in Quebec and in the rest of Canada. And this whole historical period here, going back several centuries, the fascination of the West for Asian people, which became sort of a fascination, and also witnessed some reject. That's what we call in the francophone world the return of the yellow peril. So this fascination and reject, the Vietnamese population has gone through that, and all of that created, and Julie will mention it later, the question of the relationship among sexes, for instance, in particular with the Asian women, which Julie will talk about. So in terms of the self-image, as a descendant of Asian migrants, this self-image was built also through the fantasy of others, the Western picture, the Asian who works a lot, the Asian woman, and somewhere there is this identity conflict between to conform to a certain picture and not to understand what this image is. So, and in a way, it's also becoming a slave to want to stick to this image. So I've been working on the identity questions intergenerational transmission. We have to work on that. What is not said, the colonial heritage and the transmission of the representation of being the same and different at the same time. So parents in Asian families face this contradiction. Yes, we have to integrate this world, which is rather white, but at the same time not look like them entirely. So there's a lot of contradictory information that causes a lot of suffering. So very briefly, we're working on some other directions of research, and I work with one of my colleagues, Edouard Louis and Julie, worked with us with the Czech Real. So we've seen that today when we talk about the youth and racism, there's a lot of influence on their trajectories and their behavior. And the idea of feeling excluded always from a social norm. And the work I've done, the work I look at, dates back 15 years. So there's still a constant awareness against Black people, a mental charge when we talk about the relationship with others and the effective relationship with whites as well, and the insecurities that entail. Identity tensions also that persist. 15 years ago, it was already the case. It's still the same thing, even though there's a lot of changes. So it's to want to be and not to be, also to be recognized as similar, to want to be white and to be ashamed of being oneself, and to adopt the stereotypes of others to be accepted. So there's a need today to rebuild themselves, and this is what we've seen lately, maybe thanks to the pandemic and the present changes that I notice. Now it's the combination of events that have been such that the threshold of tolerance have moved, and this, of course, all the world level of upset, and which is in part also the result of social network, and all that to help us fight this type of racism. Julie, do you want me to? Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think that it shows well the feelings that people who are descendant from migrant parents. So as a so I am second generation migrant. So this is why I worked with Sophie. So to talk about the geriatric, which looks at the situation of Asians in Quebec. It's very important, for first and third generation Asian people, mixed people also, and people that are adopted. Because when we talk about Asian people, it's not just people that descending from Asian people, but also it's the whole community as well. So that includes people who have other identities. So this is how I would like to introduce. So I'll use some of the pictures that I used in my work with UNESCO. And you can meet Cody also during the discussion with the forum today.
So please feel free to take part in that discussion. With my colleagues, we are a group of volunteers. It's a grassroots organization where we are working for and by Asian communities. With the pandemic, it's been difficult to understand why we are the scapegoats in this situation of COVID-19. And what happened in Quebec is that there are many articles that come out in the newspapers and the media indicating there's a form of stigmatization towards Asians. For example, we talk about COVID-19, there's an image of an Asian person. And so this was a triggering aspect that has repercussions. And after that, a Facebook group was created to get people together from Asian communities not only from East Asia, because we need to understand geographically there are many different countries involved in Asia, and the idea being to talk these issues over. And what happens with Asians weren't able to really put words to their lived experiences. For many, it was the first experience of racism, and so we developed supports or support groups so to inform people and to refer people to community services in terms of mental health and also for legal recourse. In the group, in the activism against racism and against systematic racism, the government today doesn't recognize systemic racism, only says, well, there is racism. So we've found different spaces politically, municipally, and federally, provincially, to put anti-Asian racism in the forefront and to take political positions to really make these issues visible among francophones in Quebec. On the next slide, in terms of testimonies,
La participation avec la recherche de Sophie
with Sophie's research,
eu comme impact.
What's had a big impact is in terms of discrimination related to your name, the name. And this is a subject that's been brought up in the self-help group. Where does our given names come from? And during this research, I said that I had to change my legal name to feel better accepted within Quebecois society. And you'll see in my slides that I added my Vietnamese name, that given name. I added the name Julie when I was 8 years old, to avoid, racism and discrimination in school. And my mother asked me if I wanted to do that, to change my given name to be better accepted within Quebecois society and have better employment opportunities. My mother was a first-generation immigrant who didn't really understand the racism issues happening in Quebec. There was no Francophone Quebecois given name, so she didn't understand that it wasn't necessarily something that could become discriminatory for me. That's why this given name was added on. And others who didn't make this legal change, but only did it socially, when someone introduces themselves in a 5 to 7 or in meetings with friends, they're going to use their Francophone Quebecois given name to avoid these confrontations in terms of their identity. Questions, where do you come from? Does your name translate? All of these are microaggressions that can impact our identity. I also wanted to add that all of these issues of discrimination related to your name can be very different for people who are adopted. So in our discussion groups, we realized it was a form of colonization because it's removing their name at birth, for example, the Chinese name, to be replaced with a Quebecois name. And as a result, this has had identity impacts because there's a desire to reappropriate your Asian identity for those who haven't had a family of Asian origins, adoptees, for example. So there are different adaptation strategies to counter racism on a daily basis and to have discussions as we did regarding your first name and to overcome resistance and put words to our lived experience and deal with different dynamics of racism within our country. The sexual fetishization that exists among Asian women, it affects us every day. This famous interview that will, when we, if we want to have an interview, Is that person, are they interested in me, or are they interested in us because we're Asian and they have this image of being submissive and easy and nice and polite? This also has, impacts on these kinds of meetups or meetings, and
sur le plan sexuel. Et donc,
including in the sexual sphere.
Avoir des espaces sûrs.
So we need to have safe spaces to create this healing among Asians, because in the fight against racism, often these aspects are neglected. And when we take part in these tables and these round tables about racism, we often forget what our particular issues are. So I will just end on that. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to write so we can get back to you later with an answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie and Julie, for your presentations and the kind of specificity of the research you're doing and the kind of consultations you're engaging in. Next, I'd like to call upon Elene to present her comments.
Hi, everyone. So I'm so glad I'm able to join this panel, and I'm so glad the sex worker issue is being mentioned in this anti-Asian racism meeting, because like most of the time, Asian and migrant sex worker is often being left behind. So I really appreciate that I can have a chance to share some of my experience working with the community, and also share some of the problems facing by the community, particularly from how they are facing the racism and also the racist attack to the community. So I'm the executive director of Butterfly, which is an Asian and migrant sex worker support network in Canada. We're based in Toronto, but we network with the worker all over different city in Canada. So what we do is provide support to the worker and also organize the worker to fight for their rights. So for the recent movement of anti-racism, Asian racism movement has started after the murder of Alander in March, including 6 Asian women being killed. And we should not forget, they are not only murdered because of the anti-Asian racism, but they are also being murdered because of the homophobia and the hate of massage parlor and sex worker. And I think this is very, very important to remember that is how some people are disproportionately being affected when people is discussing the anti-Asian racism. We should never forget why we have so much attention now on this issue after the murder is the people also being murdered of they are the massage parlor workers. So, and Asian workers in massage parlor and sex industry was not only murdered in US, but it's also often being murdered in Canada every year, but it's received almost no attention. So they are facing the anti-Asian hate and anti-sex worker hate every day. Over 30% of them have experienced different kind of violence, and majority of the violence is from law enforcement. So when we hear there is a lot of concern of anti-Asian hate, and then say that we should get more support from the police, from the community, the message is very clear. The police is not able to help us. The police is someone to hurt and harm us. So, and when we talk about anti-Asian racism, we need to look at the intersectionality lens, who are the most affected, including class, gender, language, immigration status. We also need to look at the systematic racism, not only the physical violence, but the system, how the system, the state is violence to the community, how the Asian American sex workers are discriminated, excluded, and oppressed. So for example, because of the discrimination of the law, because of the criminalization, even they are working. Now the federal government have a PR plan, so that to give the chance people working to get the immigration status. But like many precarious workers, they are not able to access, even they are working hard in this society. So even people with immigration status like work permit by refugee or like international student, if they find out they work in sex industry or erotic massage, they will be kicked out from Canada. And also some of our members also do not have any immigration status. Both vulnerability actually create a barrier. They cannot access help and social support. So Asian American sex workers are also often excluded by many Asian community and Asian group. Many of them also express the hate to sex worker community, and they are holding the anti-sex work position. But we also need to be aware of that. Many of this group, and particularly the community leader, is also the question they are also strongly influenced by the colonialism. So instead of that is coming from Asian culture or history, how we look at sex work, many of them is also adopt the colonialism lens on sex work, as is using that moralistic idea to judge sex work and exclude them from the Asian community, and also exclude from the advocacy work of the human rights and even in their anti-racism work. So that's why we need to address the racism, classism, and anti-sex work settlement within our Asian community, just like other speakers said, that the solidarity need to be built, but we need to break the wall. So if you're against the anti-Asian racism, you should also take action to stop the hate and violence against the Asian and migrant sex worker and massage parlor worker. They should not left behind. Asian and migrant sex worker facing different kind of violence and because of their different identities. So that's why, like what Butterfly is doing, trying to build a movement, build a solidarity between different movements. So for example, sex worker movement, anti-policing movement, particularly with Indigenous and Black community, LGBTQ movement, migrant movement, worker movement, and violence against women movement. So it is very important to show that they are not only the allies, but the Asian and migrant sex worker is also be part of their community. Also, it should be included in their movement. What I want to say now is really alarming, and what we see, the anti-trafficking movement now got a lot of attention. They got a lot of funding. They got a lot of political power, because it's created the illusion this policy is stop exploitation and make people more safe. But this is not true. The anti-trafficking policy is being used to cover up the racist agenda, anti-sex work, anti-migrant, and promote the colonialism in imperialism. Many of these anti-trafficking organizations are working with government and law enforcement, and many of them are the white savior, incarcerated feminists, and Christian group. They use their white supremacy and privilege to promote the moralistic agenda. Sex work is bad, immoral, is exploitation. They promote the anti-sex work hate, to call for more policing, to call for shut down the business, to call for the criminalization of sex work. So their goal is not ending exploitation. Their goal is ending sex work. And what recently in many cities like Toronto, Newmarket, what they are doing, they are ending the Asian massage parlor. The Asian business is being targeted, like the laundry business, and many cities has used the bylaw to regulate it. But what now is happened is this group is using the bylaw again to eliminate this business, particularly the Asian one. And one of the way what they do is they impose the criteria. So for example, many massage worker is using their Asian historical culture knowledge to promote, to carry out the work. Many of them have do it very long time. But now what they do, they impose the credential. They say that they need to graduate from the qualified credential college. So that what does it mean? So that that is the systematic racism. If you do not meet the English level, you even cannot enter this school. If you are poor, you cannot pay for the school fee. That what happened is that Asian workers, particularly those not English speaking, is being excluded from working, and their business is being shut down. So what we really need your help, because that's happened in many cities, many Asian women massage parlor is being shut down. One side, they say there is the, they say that they are illegal, they are unprofessional, they promote the anti-Asian and anti-sex work hate. On the other hand, they're using the racist idea of Asian women. They are passive, they're ignorant, because they speak little English, they must be trafficked. to use this way to increase policing, also shut down the business. So, so that's why what we see, they are so powerful because they have the privilege, they have the right privilege, they are having the political power. We have joined so many government meetings, but even we have so many workers, we have 300 workers went to the City Hall of Toronto, say, I'm not traffic victim, I need the work. But there was one white feminist say, there is a lot of trafficking in massage parlor. The city listened to her, not 300 workers. So that's why you see how the power is imbalanced in like other speakers say. So that's why we really need you guys, because you are in the society with different positions, that how we need to build the solidarity, having different people concerned about anti-Asian racism come together to support this group of marginalized Asian community. So this still going on. And so because they use the name of protection, it make people cannot see the real agenda. It's also make it more difficult to push back. So for example, Ontario just passed the Anti-Trafficking Act. Over 1,000 of individual organizations, including human rights organizations, social justice organizations, say that this bill is about increased policing. It's not about protecting traffic victims. But the bill is still passed without any politician against it because it's look good. It's the same as what happened to the Canadian government, how they treat the residential school. Because with the name of protection, they say that the children need to be protected, so that people think that this is the system is good. But now we know it very clear. This is not the system of protection. This is a system of violence. This is same as the anti-trafficking movement, how they use reason of anti-trafficking to remove the children from the family, to put them in childcare system. And so that's why today we are very want to calling you to support the Asian and migrant sex worker and massage parlor worker, and also stop the harm of anti-trafficking movement. We have developed a statement. We really hope all of you will sign this statement. Is really want them to stop the racist attack to Asian and migrant sex worker and massage parlor worker. We need your solidarity. We need your help to stop this racist action under the name of protection. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Elaine, for your comments. We have two more presenters. We're running a little tight on time, but I think there'll be enough time for questions and answers. The next presenter is Patrick. Perhaps you can share your comments with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me share my slides. So I'm going to present today about a little snippet, I guess, of my thesis, my undergraduate thesis about the anti-W5 movement. Je vais présenter en français et en anglais, dans l'esprit de la bilinguisme.
I'm going to present in both official languages, and I'm going to be talking about the coalition building and the anti-W5 movement. It's an anti-racist movement, was directed by Canadian Chinese during 1979 to 1980, over 1980, and that brought about the creation of the National Canadian National Council.
Donc, pour introduire,
to introduce the movement really started when the W5 on CTV presented the campus giveaway episode on September 30th, 1979. And this episode was racist. It incorrectly alleged that foreign students were taking away Canadian placements in Canadian institutions, which is false. It talked about foreigners who they were used false sources, but they also filmed and showed Chinese videos while they were talking about foreign students. So the implication was that they were all foreigners, even though we confirm that almost all of the foreign students in the film who were filmed in this show were in fact Canadian citizens or permanent residents. So for Canadian Chinese, it was a sign that even if they've become doctors, professionals, they've received education here in Canada, they have always been and will always be a foreigner.
The start of the movement actually came out of this idea that all Chinese Canadians were being painted as a perpetual foreigner. And the first responses really came from the faculty, from administrators, and from students on campuses across Canada. But it really began in the University of Toronto when students, particularly from the Chinese Students Association, established the Association of Chinese Canadian Students and Graduates alongside students from other Southern Ontario universities, which then later reached out to the rest of the Chinese Canadian community in Toronto. And how they did this was that the Council of the Chinese Canadians in Ontario, the CCCO, was hosting an event on November 10th to 11th. So students actually came to speak to the event, speak to the community leaders, and to really raise awareness and push this issue into the spotlight because they felt they were unjustly treated by CTV. And so with the help of various community organizations who heard the students' call, the ad hoc committee of the CCCO against W5 was established on November 22nd, 1979, alongside various different organizations being represented. Donc, ce qui est important.
So what's important about the W5 movement is that they looking for alliances within different community groups, not only among the Sino-Canadian communities, but others. And they received support from the society in general, the media, human rights organizations, social justice, and other racialized communities. And this really created a lot of racial solidarity. And this was a period just after the human rights in the United States, civil rights movement, and there were several racialized communities who responded to the call of the Canadian Chinese for racial solidarity. For example, there was the South Asian community, Japanese community, and other Canadians of Asian origins who supported this national movement against CTV to demand them to present their apologies for this racist episode. But also, they received support from the Black community. There were several organizations, human rights Black organizations, that supported the anti-W5 movement. For example, George Bancroft and Vincent Head, who were leaders, and other leaders in human rights and civil rights movements. They spoke in a forum at an anti-W5 event to support the Chinese community at the time.
Wasn't without internal dissent, and I think it really shows that the Chinese Canadian community is not a monolith. We're separated by class, we're separated by political beliefs, we're separated by even the origin from where we are and the dialect we come from. And so there were conservative members of the ad hoc committees who opposed the use of public protests in the lawsuit against CTV, and they didn't agree with what they saw as a radical faction of progressive activists. But actually, the progressive activists successfully mobilized community support for the protests and the lawsuit. So they built a coalition within the Chinese Canadian community by really, firstly, moderating their language and image. We saw, at least when I interviewed a lot of these activists for my thesis, a lot of them emphasized that not only did they talk about racism, of course, but it also focused on this messaging, as you see here, on irresponsible journalism. They really emphasized CTV's irresponsible journalism, the false statistics they use. And that was something that they used to try to appeal to a larger audience beyond just the progressive activists in the grassroots community. But also they held public forums and screenings of Campus Giveaway. And I think this is the most important point. I'm not saying that, of course, you should moderate all radical discourse. I think radical discourse is important. But I think that you need to meet communities where they are. And I think that the anti-W5 movement did a really good job of having a presence on community sidewalks and having a presence at public forums and having screenings at Campus Giveaway all across the country, showing the video and explaining what was wrong in both English and Chinese. I think those are really, really important important strategies as part of a movement when you're trying to build a coalition. Because you need to raise awareness, you need to educate, and you need to have people understand the issues that you're trying to advocate for. So the anti-W5 movement was successful, actually. CTV apologized on April 16th, 1980 for their episode. And I think that's really important to note because that they were able to raise so much awareness and build that coalition, not only within the Chinese community, but then also with the larger community in English Canada. So just a little bit of relevance today, coalition building and racial solidarity is really crucial within and beyond Asian Canadian communities. So we really need to look within our communities, but also beyond to try to extend a hand and build a consensus across a larger group to build that critical mass for any movement. But also coalition building involves awareness raising and education. We really need to have our communities even and our own people understand the issues at stake and to really speak to them and meet them halfway, to go to their communities, to go to our own go for our organizations, go to where people work to really explain, these issues and to really mobilize support through there. And I'd like to relate this to the 105 Kiefer fight, which is a documentary I work on with UBC's Instruct as a research assistant, because there was a coalition of various groups in Vancouver's Chinatown who might not necessarily have had similar views or were differentiated by class, but they still came together to oppose a certain issue. And I think that's also what's important, is that you can have to choose specific issues. You have to choose specific catalysts that can help propel your movement forward and to really achieve success in coalition building. So I'll keep my remarks short because we're running out of time, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick. I didn't mean to rush you. I'm sure we can pick up some of these very practical things that you're pointing at in the hopefully the question and answer section. And so the next speaker is Lara, who's going to share her presentation with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zul. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is.
So greetings, everyone.
The time to share my comments and thoughts in this convening. I think it's really important that this National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism is convened by us as Asians, as Asian Canadians, by us, for us, and about us. And yet I am acutely aware that I am the only woman from the Filipinx diaspora who has had the opportunity to share comments and be part of this discourse in this morning's plenary sessions. I have found in my experience, and this has also been shared with me by many people in my community, that we are all, in my experience, I'm almost always the only Filipino person at the table. And oftentimes I am the only Filipino even at the Asian table. I want to recognize my privilege in that, and that even within my own community, in the Filipino diaspora community, I occupy a position of privilege that not everybody, and certainly not all Filipino women, have that same level of privilege. Why are we having this conversation now? These conversations have happened time and time again. Our other generations have been grappling with these same issues. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.
The more it changes, the more it looks the same.
Very hard truths, and we are experiencing new wounds on top of old wounds that still haven't healed, wounds of intergenerational trauma. And we know that racism is a pre-existing condition, and anti-Asian racism predates the maple leaf flag. This is Canada. We know that. We see that over and over again, and it has come out. And there has been a resurgence more publicly during the pandemic that has made that visible to others who are not Asian and who don't live with the pervasive oppression of anti-Asian racism and all of the other isms that many of us experience over generations. I also want to acknowledge that this is happening in June, and June in Canada is Indigenous History Month, and it is Pride Month, and it is also Philippine Heritage Month. And I think for me, it's very meaningful for me that those three, that this month is acknowledging and naming those three things, because I think the intersectionality and the common cause that others have spoken to. Dr. Satwinder Bains spoke about this, and the other presenters acknowledged this as well. That is really, really important when we are talking about anti-Asian racism in the contemporary context and not just in the historical context. I want to acknowledge the debt of gratitude to Black feminists and scholars without whom we wouldn't have some of the language that we are all using, the language of intersectionality. The women like Kimberly Crenshaw and the women of the Combahee River Collective, and also the scholarship of people of Asian descent to critical race theory. I want to name that and I want to acknowledge that. These are all the ways in which we have collectively been working towards this discourse and resisting these systems of oppression. I think about with Indigenous History Month in this country, I think not only about the First Nations here, But I also think about the Indigenous people in the country where I have my roots in the Philippines. And even today, Indigenous land defenders here and in the Philippines continue to resist, have always resisted colonial power, and have always fought for and continue to fight for sovereignty of their land and their water and their own systems of governance. I also want to acknowledge, because it's Pride Month, that trans folks, especially Black and Brown trans folks, have always and continue to resist the patriarchy in ways that provide liberation and freedom to all of us. And, you know, Indigenous land defenders, Black and Brown trans folks, they do this at huge risk to themselves and to their communities. And I think that we need to think about that and acknowledge that. Again, I know the other speakers have named that as well. You know, the question that I'm grappling with in this moment in 2021 in Canada is quote unquote Asian Canadian. Is this a political identity that we have established? Is this something that actually exists? Are we coming together under this political identity of being, you know, taking on this self-identification as Asian Canadian to resist all of these systems of oppression and to uplift each other? You know, there's been a lot of conversation over the past year or so about this notion of model minority and the proximity to whiteness that many of our communities and many of us have, as individuals, have enjoyed, especially those of us who can speak official languages fluently, who have been able to attain high levels of education, who have, you know, citizenship in Canada and all of those other factors. But as we have discovered, or as we have been painfully reminded, that all it takes is a piece of fabric covering our nose and our mouth to sever that proximity to whiteness and to dissolve that illusion that somehow we are exempt from some of the other more violent aspects and more oppressive aspects that Indigenous folks and Black folks and so many other folks who don't enjoy as many class privileges have always faced and continue to face. So these are some of the things, you know, that I'm thinking about, that even if we attain education, if we have perfect elocution, even if we are well behaved, even if we are compliant, it doesn't change our vulnerability and our lack of power and our lack of decision making over how we feel resources should be redistributed, and that we still exist in these inequities. I also think about you know, what is going on in our own communities that I know even in my own family is very hard to name, and that is, you know, anti-Blackness and colorism. You know, that is a very, very difficult conversation in my own family, in my own community, in my culture. And I see this across Asian cultures as well. Transphobia, homophobia, anti-Muslim hate. I see this, you know, I also appreciate that these are moments of solidarity. You know, I see that the Sikh community comes together to support the Muslim community and vice versa. When you see these more overt examples, horrific examples of violence and killing, because of that recognition and that solidarity. And that to me is a hopeful model of coalition building and true solidarity that I appreciate. You know, Elene was talking about the phobia and the discrimination, the oppression that sex workers and the objectification and exploitation that women, and particularly Asian women, have always faced. I think that's really, really important as well. And these are very difficult conversations. You know, as a Filipino woman, I also acknowledge that you know, perhaps the ability for some of you and for many of the other people that I've been around, many of my colleagues and peers in my different workplaces, that their ability, especially as women, to show up and to foster their careers is because they've been able to employ Filipino women to provide essential childcare and domestic work and to take care of their elders. And you know, my question is always, you know, does my anti-Asian racism, does our anti-Asian racism include those Filipino women who are taking care of our children, who are taking care of our elders? You know, does it include the low-wage workers who need 2 or 3 survival jobs and don't have benefits or sick leave? Does it include the temporary foreign workers and the people without status who are in precarious situations and vulnerable to exploitation? does it include Black and brown folks? Does it include Muslim folks and people who wear religious symbols and articles of faith, who are just as much a part of our communities as everyone else? This panel is about common cause and what are some of the things that we can sort of find commonality around. And, I was involved in some work in pandemic response, and, what I continue to see is that communities were coming together and using their own labor, their volunteer labor, to translate and make sure that very essential life and death critical information was available to their communities who continue to be disproportionately affected by COVID. I think these aren't even bold or innovative actions. These are basics. Language accessibility. We know that there are these commonly spoken languages, these mother tongues that have been spoken in Canada for a long time. This is not something that is just in the 2016 census, and it's not something that's going to show up in the census that is being undertaken right now. Race-based data. This is something that people have been talking about for a very, very long time. So let's move forward with that. These are basics. These are table stakes. These are fundamentals. But let's also say that we need to have a really strong say in how that data is collected, how that data is used, and have a measure of data sovereignty over that. And when we're looking at disaggregating that data, that we're not kind of lumping ourselves all together under Pan-Asian, that we're deciding how we are counted and how that data is gathered. And then the bigger things that really will, I think, make a difference, which are around shifts in power and shifts in the equitable redistribution of wealth and of resources. Everyone has shared so many really, really substantive and meaningful things, but I guess I'll just share, the thoughts that I have, which is that, I do think that we need a seat at the table, not just, speaking as a Filipino person, as Asian Canadians, absolutely. That table exists in part because of our labor, sometimes the exploitation of our labor. But I also think that there needs to be more focus on what does it look like for us to build our own tables. That's what I'm interested in. And the question is, are we ready to do that? Have we done the necessary work between us? Who is still missing from this discourse? Are we centering the folks who are still at the margins of this Asian Canadian discourse? How well do we know each other? Do we respect each other? Do we see each other as equals? And, do we trust each other? Trust is a really big question between and amongst our communities and within our communities. So as I mentioned, June is Philippine Heritage Month in Canada, and June 12th is Philippine Independence Day. It's a celebration that many in the Filipino diaspora community, mark all over the world and certainly here in Canada. It's the time of year where we usually gather in large numbers in public, and it's probably like the weekend or two of the year where we're seen. We're not doing that this year. We didn't do that last year because of COVID. But the 100 and something anniversary of Philippine independence is a bit of a misnomer because in the way that I look at it, when I think about the Filipino diaspora community and when I think about the Philippines, we have not attained that liberation and that independence, and we're still not free. And so when I think of this holiday that comes around every year that I have been marking with my grandparents and parents since I was a child, I choose instead to honor and remember Lapu-Lapu. And that legacy of resistance that I think is a common thread that I see here in the territories and the stolen land of the Musqueam and the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh, and that resistance and that strength and that assertion of sovereignty. And so those are sort of, there's not a formal presentation that I have, but those are really the bigger questions that I continue to grapple with and that I have grappled with in thinking about what I wanted to share using this platform this morning. Sa aking mga kababayan, sana marinig ang aking boses dito sa Canada. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your comments. Thank you to all of you for a very rich set of presentations and I think foregrounding questions that will hopefully be touched upon in the breakout panels and during the work to be done tomorrow. We have some limited time now in terms of trying to engage with the questions. There have been some questions that have risen to the top in the Slido questions. So I'm going to read out the question. Not everybody needs to jump in if you don't feel there's no compulsion to respond. But if you do choose to respond, it would be great if you could keep your comments under a minute, because if we want everybody to share, then unfortunately that's the only time we have left now. So the top question in the list is the following. The question is: groups are targeted, they aren't the problem. White supremacy is. But saying white supremacy gets people shut down, defensive, and attacked. How do we discuss and dismantle white supremacy if attacks for even saying white supremacy are an issue? So again, a question that requires a much longer answer than the time we have. But if any panelist just wants to indicate to me that they want to jump in first on this, they can do so. Okay, Satwinder, go ahead.
While I understand the question, I want to preface the question by saying white supremacy is a problem for all of us, but is largely a problem for white people. And they need to come forward and find ways to tell us how they're going to question it and address it. And I think the burden is not on me now to hold white supremacy and explain it and find ways for them to have comfortable places to speak about it. You know, that time is gone. I think the time has come for people who are of European descent and who must make claim to their backgrounds and find ways to dismantle that. It is not up to us to define that.
Thank you. Who wants to speak next? You can just indicate visually to me. Okay, so we only have one comment in response to that question. The next question on the queue is, how do we better connect different types of Asian communities over the singular goal of fighting white supremacy to tackle anti-Asian racism? And I guess I would flip the question a little bit just to say, if there was like one practical strategy that you could name, which is based in the specific geography of where you're speaking from now, what would be that one practical strategy that could build or help to build cross-community and cross-cultural solidarities? And again, keep your answers brief so that everybody can get a chance. Who would like to try to respond to some of that? Okay, Elene?
Yes, I think it's just like Lara said, we always need to think who are being excluded, right? So, and I think this is the danger. We think that like Asian community is one thing. We can have a common goal, but I think this is very important. We need to acknowledge the diversity and also how the intersectional lens play out, and particularly who are being excluded. And white supremacy is so smart because they mostly target the most vulnerable. They are most voiceless. So that's why I think this is very, very important.
Anybody else? Okay. Sorry, Satwinder, go ahead.
Well, I will just take a moment. Practically, Zul, coming from the Fraser Valley and BC, I think we need a provincial conversation, and then across the country, connect with other organizations and national organizations and have a sort of conversation across the regions. Geographically, we need to do that.
Okay. Any other comments to that? Okay. The next question on the queue is, how do we engage Asian voices who are not at the table of anti-racism conversations that are often very academic and intellectual? So I think that's a fair question. We're being hosted within an academic environment, obviously with many community voices involved. But this person wants to know, how do we have these conversations and take them away from very academic and kind of intellectual zones? I'm just trying to think in the context of giving people an opportunity. Do either Sophie or Julie wish to respond to that? They don't have to. I'm just offering an opportunity. Or anyone else. Julie, do you want to jump in? Great, thank you.
Je vais répondre en
I will answer in French to that question.
So really, to be invited at that table, it's intellectual style, but we have the means to be able to express. To express on how we experience the racism. We don't have to say it on an academic level, because somebody who experiences that can still be an activist, a militant about it. And the reason we are not invited at these round tables, these conversation tables, is because we have that myth of model minority that is to use it to avoid that we be really expressing ourselves about it, and that we can link with our brothers and sisters, racialized brothers and sisters. And as Lara mentioned in her presentation, we had to create that coalition with other groups, the Black, the First Nation communities that are already there. And then we must maybe start really creating that alliance with other racialized community to join the conversation that is happening right now on racism.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in quickly. Just looking back in history as well, as part of my thesis, I did research into the 70s and the community organizing that was happening in Toronto's Chinatown at the time. And I do want to give a huge shout out to Winnie Ng, who was responsible for organizing a lot of garment workers in Toronto throughout the 1970s. And part of her engagement with garment workers was engaging with them in preparing ESL classes that were geared around things like labor rights, how to argue for better wage, how to unionize. These are useful things to help disenfranchised or disadvantaged communities within the Asian Canadian community to engage with broader community organizations and broader community organizing initiatives. And that way we can actually meet them where they are again, like I was saying in my presentation. And I think that also when we talk about engaging Asian voices around a table, there's of course different Asian groups that are not underrepresented, but there's also of course intersection of gender and class that we also need to consider. And we also need to engage the sexual minorities and as well as women in our conversations and bring them to the table. I'm glad that there's so many women here today as co-panelists with me.
Great. Anyone else want to jump in before we come to the end of our panel? Okay, well, thank you all very much. We're just about on time. I thank you all for your generous commitments of time and energy. I look forward to the issues you've raised being pursued through the rest of the forum over the next day and a half, and hopefully in the concluding comments. I thank the organizers and the audience for participating. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Zul.
Thank you.